Britain's colonial history, oppressive and harmful, or a force for development and progress? To discuss this, I'm joined by Nigel Biggar, a professor of theology at Oxford and author of a new book called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Welcome.
Thanks, William, for having me on.
Good to see you. So, first, why did you feel the need to write this book at this time?
William, for several reasons, but all of them political. So this book is not an exercise in simple history. It's written for a political purpose. Contrary to my accent, I'm actually Scottish.
I can pick it. I can pick it.
A Northumberland man might notice it. Yeah. So in the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence, I was a natural unionist, but I felt obliged to look at arguments that some Scots Nats were putting forward for independence. And one argument I came across can be reduced to the equation Britain equals empire equals evil. And so Scotland needs to sever its ties with this clapped-out, morally compromised Britain and sail off into a bright new sin-free European future.
Yes.
So that was the immediate spark. I realised that colonial history was being used for political purposes. And then more recently, of course, when Black Lives Matter crossed the Atlantic in the wake of George Floyd's killing in May 2020, the story here became Britain is systemically racist because of our colonial past, which can be summed up in one word: slavery. And I thought to myself, well, first of all, there's lots of empirical evidence that we are one of the least racist countries in the world. And secondly, you can't identify colonialism with slavery because the British Empire spent the second half of its life engaged in anti-slavery. So I thought, but again, it was a political use.
It's interesting you mentioned the Scottish angle, because we were meant to record this yesterday and I was stuck on a train, and sitting next to me on the train was a young Scot from Edinburgh who was getting a job in London, and I was discussing Scottish nationalism with him. And one of the conclusions we came to together was that one of the reasons that Scottish nationalism is so popular among the young on the data, big majority support it, is that we've spent 30 or 40 years hammering British history, vilifying it. And therefore it's simply easier to be Scots for young people than it is to be British. So that's one of the consequences. We might look into that.
Yeah.
So you're trying to get a balanced and nuanced, fair assessment of British imperial history. One of the first problems that you have, I think, or the challenge for the book, is that, or the first problem in judging, is actually there are many phases of the British Empire, and there are, so therefore the British Empire is doing different things in different places at different times. That is a challenge, because there isn't one thing, is there?
No, that's right. That's right. So you've got the empire lasted 400 years from perhaps as early as 1550s till the 1960s. It existed from Newfoundland to New Zealand. It was different things in different places. So one basic thing I wanted to interject into the public discussion was the notion that you can't talk about the empire as if it was a project.
Yeah.
And you can't reduce it to a single thing, because it was different things at different times, which makes the kind of overall moral assessment of it really
very difficult,
complicated.
Yeah.
But the first thing to do is to complicate the story, because the story being put about by lots of people on the progressive cultural left is a highly simplistic one.
I agree with you. I think it's simplistic and unlearned, unnuanced, and therefore false.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But again, it is being simplified for political purposes. I mean, when I first began to be involved in these issues during the Rose Must Fall campaign here in Oxford, I noticed that the several hundred protesters really weren't interested in the truth about history. So Rose was South Africa's Hitler. Rose was involved in concentration camps in the Second Boer War. Rose was genocidal. None of those claims have a grounding in the fact. But it doesn't matter, because it's useful politically.
And the problem nowadays is that people introduce these ideas often on social media, and the idea is around the world and you can't stop it. And they really are nuanced. It's challenging, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think when you talk about social media and sort of global circulation of these toxic memes, I think of the case in Canada of the residential schools.
Yes.
Where 3 years ago the story was put about in in the New York Times and then Al Jazeera that genocide had taken place in residential schools in Western Canada. These are schools that native Indian kids used to attend. It's now appearing as if that's an entire myth. But the story's gone over the world.
Yes, and if you did a poll in Canada and probably beyond, quite a few people would accept that account, even though it's false.
They would. And the media, the mainstream media, bear a huge responsibility for this because they pick the stuff up uncritically, broadcast it, and when it's shown to be false, do they admit it? No, they don't.
Well, a huge problem there, Nigel, is that a lot of our mainstream media is captured by people that put everything through a filter. So everything's through a sort of progressive filter, and if it doesn't fit a narrative, we just don't. It's not so much. I mean, it is. They do make errors like anyone else, but it's not so much that what they're saying is untrue. It's that they filter out the rest of it.
Yes.
They would balance it. But on Oxford, just to go back to that briefly, you are in the book. I think you describe it as Oxford fiddles while Africa burns. And the point is, I mean, that's a real point. Because they're getting upset about the statutes, on the highway outside Oriel, which incidentally I think should be protected under town planning legislation. That would protect it. It's a list of buildings, you shouldn't alter it. But that's a separate point. But they are fiddling because actually, how many slaves are there in Africa today? 30 million.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yep.
Let's get back to the point of the book really on judging imperial history, and one of the sort of hairs that they've set off is the idea somehow, and it's accepted I think generally now, that there's something inherently bad about imperial structures, something peculiar to them. So the decolonisation movement imply that violence, slavery and oppression is inherent, intrinsic to imperial structures. And my point on that would be, well, there are plenty of nation states and other arrangements that do that too. Human beings do that. So would you say that, there's anything intrinsic to imperial structures that would imply that?
Well, first of all, I agree with you, William. Everything that is thrown at empires can be thrown at nation states too. And in fact, the distinction between nation state and empire is not a clear one because, England began as Wessex, expanded imperially, became the nation state of England. As for whether, yes, the decolonizers like to talk about violence being intrinsic to empires. Well, look, violence is intrinsic to any state. Every state exists by means of the threat of violence. It has armed forces, it has police. So that doesn't distinguish empires. Did the British Empire use violence a lot? Yes, it did, but then other empires did too, other nations did too, because the world in the past was even more insecure than our current world. Did the British misuse violence sometimes? Yes, they did. But when was the British Empire most violent? In the war against Nazism.
Yes.
Most of us would prove on.
Key point. Yeah.
The decolonizers tend to think the coercion violence is in itself wrong. I just think that's nonsense. It depends.
Yeah, it depends. And actually, your point about what constitutes an empire is an interesting one, because a state, for instance, the modern state of Ethiopia, which I visited, it was invaded by Italy, but it was largely uncolonized. It wasn't colonized, Abyssinia. And yet the modern state of Ethiopia certainly has an empire. I mean, the Amharic people that dominate the north. You go down to the Omo Valley, you've got several tribes that are completely separate, and actually in effect, that's their empire. I mean, they control it imperially.
Yeah. So I guess one of the features of an empire is you do have you have dominant peoples and subordinate peoples.
Yes.
But that's actually a common feature of even of nations. I mean, in the UK, the English people, 55 million, dominate in a certain sense the Scots at 5 million.
Yes.
There are ways of...
Not always intellectually, though. Hey.
Not always intellectually.
Yeah.
No. In the European Union, there are dominators and dominated. There are ways of... So all large political organizations have to deal with the problem of inequalities of power, and you mitigate in certain ways. And the idea that the British Empire and the other empire is simply a matter of oppressors dominating the dominated is far too simple, because the numbers of Brits in India in 1900, India contained 300 million Indians in 1900. It contained how many Brits? 164,000.
Yes.
The population of Oxford, totally. Which does suggest that the Raj could not have survived could not have functioned without widespread buy-in from Indians. Now,
Consent.
Assent.
Yeah.
Now, the critics might say, well, the Indians were duped or the Indians were coerced. Sometimes they were coerced. Often they had interests of their own, which made it made sense that they should cooperate with the British. So, Tatanka Roy, in his account of the British in India in the 1700s, says it wasn't simply a matter of the East India Company conquering India. It was the East India Company being drawn into alliances with some Indians against others. Because some Indians so it was in their interest to cooperate with the company. So,
as the Mughal Empire left vacuums of various kinds.
Exactly.
And,
So the story that it's all about the oppressed on the one hand, the oppressors on the other is again far too simple.
Well, let's just have another look at, just to take that one stage further, it's these competing values that interest me. So you've got the fact, which I think is obvious, you can an imperial structure be autocratic yet humanitarian.
Yeah.
It can lack democracy, but it can favour, in fact, minority rights, minority groups' rights.
Yes.
That's quite an important point, isn't it? It's not as simple as, we're Democrats, we like democracy, but actually imperial structures often are favoured by groups that don't want to be in a nation state that's dominated by one group.
Yeah. It's an uncomfortable truth for Democrats to recognise. I'm a Democrat, just for the record.
Yes.
But we all know that mass democracy has its own problems. But it surely wasn't the case, was it, that sufficient political justice first visited the earth with mass American democracy in the early 1800s? That just seems to me to be implausible. I mean, sufficient justice was done before then, often by autocratic regimes. But the thing about autocracies is to notice that an autocracy that's going to last can't operate in defiance of and in ignorance of the needs of the people. Otherwise, it's going to provoke revolt. So even autocracies have ways of being of communication between the top and the bottom. And the Raj in India was an autocracy until the 1900s. But yes, it did have Indians involved in government. It did have Indians presiding over courts as early as the 1880s. And you can have benign, benevolent, humanitarian autocrats.
Well, as far as administration is concerned, another perhaps uncomfortable fact is that imperial order can be just simply more efficient. I mean, or less corrupt than local order.
Yes.
Local order. I mean, it's funny, when I was reading the book, one of the things that flashed past me was if you're an imperial subject and you accepted the fact that the British were quite good at organising railways or schools or hospitals or new industries, and you might well do because you benefit from them, you might accept that, but it grates against a sense of self-governance and anti-colonialism, which we all had. I mean, actually in the post-war period, a state like, which you mentioned, Peter Godwin's book, Makiwa on Rhodesia, fascinating, because actually white settlement, and it was brutal at times, did achieve the Bulawayo to Salisbury Railway, 3 decent industries in wheat and tobacco and tea, and a lot of people, on the data, it was quite beneficial. But you can't get around the fact that British government could not accept that we couldn't have self-determination, and that was the issue.
Yeah. But I'm inclined to think, William, that self-determination matters more to some than others. I mean, I think it matters to educated, ambitious elites who resent being governed by foreign peoples, or particularly resent not being allowed to rise to the top of government, as was the case in African colonies in the 1950s and 60s. On the other hand, the people down below, they've always been ruled by other people. And the truth is, even in our democracies, ask the poor working class, they're used to other people ruling them. What they care about more is the quality of rule. They don't really care what skin colour the guy at the top has. And in India, people had always been ruled by other people. It was the British who first began to introduce democracy into India for the first time in its history.
Yeah, and it's not a new concept. I mean, a lot of Italians, some Portuguese perhaps, the initial fondness for the European Union administration was that it might be less corrupt than our own. So that's the point. It's not particularly new.
Yeah.
I want to turn to you talk about motives a lot, because of course the critics of the colonial record put motives onto the imperial project of greed and racial oppression and so on. And again, it's not really as simple as that. I mean, you mentioned other impulses for imperial projects that all European states had: discovery, exploration, trade, and self-improvement. Those are important things, aren't they? Then it's not. So then yet again, the narrative, the decolonisation narrative, is actually too simple.
Yeah. So Brits didn't wake up some Sunday morning in London and decide, well, let's go conquer the world because we fancy dominating other people.
Yes.
I mean, for sure, some people do like dominating others, but that wasn't the primary impulse. Trade was, without doubt, the leading impulse at the beginning. That's why the British ended up in India. And personally, I've got nothing against trade. I've got nothing against profit making. And another major impulse for colonisation was emigration. Lots of poor, particularly Scots and Irish, were looking for a better life, just like people from Africa looking for a better life by crossing the English Channel. Did they sometimes transgress on the lands of other peoples in North America and Australia? Yes, they did. But they weren't particularly interested in beating up other peoples. Their main motive was a better life. And we can sympathise with that. Was it greed? No, not necessarily. So the desire for a better life, the desire to make your way in the world, and yes, sheer curiosity. I mean, what sent Captain Cook to Australasia was discovery, and his boat was full of scientific equipment.
And an astrological survey as well.
So lots of innocent motives, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the very first, if you were to count it in this, and actually you don't count it in your book, I don't think you mention it, but the first, the inverted commas, just European discovery of the Americas was Leif Erikson's Viking trips, probably 3 vessels, possibly 999, possibly 20 years later.
Right.
But actually, you couldn't. I mean, that was sheer discovery, exploration. They wanted to see what was next to Greenland.
Yeah.
They, to imply that there was some sort of motive to oppress people would be absurd. They didn't even know there were any people.
No,
never mind anyone else. So it's just sheer. What is that?
Curiosity. I mean, if you just think about what human beings are like, we are naturally curious, and our ancestors were no different from that.
Yeah.
They happen to have developed maritime technology that could enable them to cross oceans. And we can be quite sure that if Aboriginal Australians or native North Americans had developed that technology, they would have ended up here.
Yeah, it depends on the accounts, but on Aboriginal Australians, presumably they got there 40,000 years from somewhere, possibly further north. That itself is exploration.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I forget the details exactly, I think 50,000 years ago there was a migration from what's
Indonesia,
now Indonesia into Australia, so they too were migrants.
So as a human, it's a ubiquitous.
Yeah, it is. It is.
We must deal with the question of slavery because that certainly on the politics that absolutely dominates. Yeah. So anti-colonialists like to claim that British, not only the imperial project, but the British prosperity is founded on slavery. You read that quite a lot. What do you make of that claim?
Well, I make what historians make of it. I mean, some claim that slavery made an enormous contribution to slavery. Eric Williams, 1940, Marxist Trinidadian, made that claim. Most economic historians don't agree with them. Most think it was modest, maybe 12% GDP. Some reckon even less. So anyone who claims that British prosperity was founded on slavery is not telling the truth. There were all sorts of other factors. And the fact is that Spain and Portugal were just as involved in slave trading and slavery, made just as much profit from slave trading and slavery. They did not develop an industrial economy, which is what made Britain exceptionally prosperous in the 1800s. So,
and other European nations developed complex industrial economies without any involvement, without involvement.
That's right. So first of all, the claim that Britain's prosperity is founded on slavery is simply untrue. It's far too simplistic. Yes, it contributed something, but historians don't agree on how much.
It's interesting, though, politically, because you've got, in the city we were talking from, Sadiq Khan, the mayor, has just announced a new monument to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, that's an important issue, and we need to be aware of it. But it's interesting, and I think revealing, that he's disinclined, for instance, to celebrate its abolition.
Yeah.
Why doesn't he celebrate its abolition?
And I guess that to me, that exposes the political nature of the memorialization here. To commemorate the victims is to feed the narrative that so-called anti-racist groups propagate, that we are a fundamentally racist society, and this is all to do with colonialism, which is identifiable with slavery. So again, it's the political end of that is significant. My own view is that that's racially divisive.
I think so. No, I totally agree with you, because I mean, part of our political project as a party is to bring people together to try and find a new us. I think unless you can do that, then the sort of civic nationalism that we espouse has no future. You've got to have something to buy into. Therefore, you must unify people. Now, if Khan had a new statue to celebrate the abolition of slavery and its suppression, we could all, really get together and say how wonderful that was. It's a problem. It does reveal that it's being used as a tool.
But, I mean, I think just on the issue of racial division, so the story that Khan appears to be promoting through this is that black people are victims, white people are oppressors. The truth is, yes, some white people were slave traders and slave owners. Other white people were slave emancipators. On the other hand, yes, lots of black people were enslaved. Other black people enslaved them before selling to Europeans. So there's both virtue and sin on both sides.
Of course, and actually, if you're an Ashanti and you're living in London, you're pretty likely you might have had some family involvement in slavery.
Yes.
So we're talking about slavery, get onto reparations, because that's the next stage is to look at that question. And a lot of institutions, anyway, corporations, universities, and others are looking at
Church of England.
Church of England, and the universities are looking at this question of reparations. So it's fashionable for some Europeans, to be seen to atone for empire or slavery anyway. What do you make of the ethics? Actually, can I just go a little bit deeper into it? Because as an ethicist, obviously we can take responsibility. We need to take responsibility for our own actions, what we've said and done, right? How can it be ethically justified to take responsibility and pay for the actions of 6 generations ago? How can that be How can that be made?
I don't think a good case can be made. So let me just make a positive point first of all. Of course, if there are ethnic minorities in our country who suffer disadvantages that are unjust, we should address those here and now. And of course, we're a wealthy country, relatively speaking, and we have an oppressive development and aid budget. Nevertheless, we can't save the whole world, so we have to choose, and one reason for choosing, let's say, to give aid to the Caribbean is that we have an historical association with them. So I'm all for rectification of unjust inequalities in our country, and also the giving of aid to countries who need it. That aside, so why do reparations for slavery 200 years ago not make good sense? First of all, why pick on us? I mean, slavery was a universal institution practiced on every continent by people of every skin color. By some reckonings, more Africans were enslaved by Arabs and taken to the Mediterranean and the Middle East than Africans were enslaved by whites and taken to the Americas. Why pick on us?
But there was something we have to accept. One of the points, just as I would say, is probably a historical fact, that transatlantic slavery is particularly barbaric.
It was, and the chattel slavery in the West Indies was often very brutal indeed. Nevertheless, there were plantations in West Africa and East Africa run by Muslims in the 1800s. And if you read accounts of the suffering of white slaves in Arab galleys in the Mediterranean, it was very brutal indeed. So I grant you that enslaved Africans in the West Indies were generally treated very brutally indeed. Slaves elsewhere were not much better treated either.
I mean, slavery in West Africa now, slavery still exists. It's quite widespread, but the type of slavery you get is very often common in countries like Ghana is sort of household slavery. You know,
Yeah,
you're just going to. It's slightly different. It's a slightly different thing.
Yeah, no, you're quite right to say that there are different kinds of slavery. Some not at all as bad as what happened in the West Indies, but plantation slavery was what I was referring to in the Sokoto Caliphate in what's now Nigeria, and also on the coast of East Africa run by Arabs. So plantation slavery is worse than household slavery. I gather the conditions there were generally not as bad as the West Indies. But again, if you read accounts of Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, he was captured and enslaved and put onto the galleys. And one of his mates wrote an account of Cervantes' experience. It was very brutal indeed.
But your point remains, which is a valid one, which is that why this particular empire at the particular time, and the retort to it, the sort of flippant retort would be, we'll pay you just as soon as the Romans paid us.
Yeah. But to build on that point, okay, so one question is why pick on the Brits in particular? Second point is why pick on the Brits when the British were among the first people in the history of the world?
Is that unique? Was it? I mean, it was unique as a large empire.
Not unique in that I think
the French Revolution.
The French abolished slave trading in 1793, but Napoleon reversed it 10 years later. The Danes abolished the slave trade in 1804. We followed 1807. But we then, after the victory at Waterloo, we led Europe and pressed Europe to abolish slave trading and slavery with some success over a period of decades. So we were the leading. We weren't the first to abolish the slave trade and slavery, but we became the leading anti-slavery state. So again, why pick on us? Yes,
and there's a scale, it's an order of magnitude bigger than any Danish. Yeah, but the Danes have stopped slavery, well, fine, that's good. But it's the quantum of good you could do after 1807, the British Empire stopping it, it was completely different.
So one thing those calling for reparations simply refused to take into account is, okay, if we have a certain debt for slave trading and slavery, what about the credit? I mean, what about the 150 years of anti-slavery activity that needs to be put in the credit column? And they never do that.
No, they don't, because what it's stopped because they're using this political tool. They're using for instrumental reasons.
But the last thing to say on this point, William, has to do with what's happened in the last 200 years. So yes, slaves in the West Indies 200 years ago were in a very bad state. The decolonisers want to say that nothing important has changed the last 200 years. I put that to Tirthankar Roy, the professor of the history of economics, specialising in colonial economics at the London School of Economics here in London. Has nothing changed? Is the current mess in Caribbean countries all due to slavery 200 years ago? And his response was nonsense. I mean, much of the problem has to do with recent mismanagement.
Oh yeah, sure. And I think that's one of the things that another point. I mean, I have an interest in economics, and one of the major hurdles you will have trying to make a rational case for reparations is to have your demonstrable harm quantified.
Yes.
It is extraordinarily difficult to do so. In fact, if anything, and it's extremely uncomfortable to say this, but actually the opposite probably is true, that actually the greater involvement, if you look at most of the West Indies states have higher GDPs than West African states. South Africa has the highest GDP, although it's not now well governed at all. It was the only one that was colonized. So Liberia, Haiti, Ethiopia don't have high GDPs per capita, and so it's very difficult to make the actual case. I mean, in the case of someone like Barbados, which is quite a successful state and has quite a high per capita GDP, in any balance sheet of the whole wretched project, because it was a wretched project, you'd have to put in the credit column Barbados. what modern barbarians. They're very difficult, and I think, and you make a point, a more nuanced point, I think, about the fact that, or do you agree with this, that actually the reparation, these are incommensurate things. What people are really looking at is atonement for an evil, which is not a monetary thing. You can't say, well, I'll just give you some money.
Well, and so there's no way of undoing what some of our ancestors did 200 years ago. We can, and those who suffered are dead. So, as a self-conscious, self-identifying Briton, I lament what some of my people did. And my people didn't do it, but some did. I lament that, and I admire the abolitionists. We can't deal with that past. We can address the present, and that's what we should do. But that's aid. And it's rectification of injustice. It's not reparations.
I think that's right. You mentioned another theme that goes right through this is the asymmetry, as we'd say, in the narrative, the political narrative about empires generally, and it is unfashionable. People don't seem inclined to compare like with like. And as a sort of second-rate philosopher, somebody say, well, you're not comparing. Well, you can't compare like with like. You have to compare things that are different. But anyway, leave that aside. You have to, when people are having a go at the British Empire, the Ottoman Turks, the Aztecs, the Fulani slave empire, the Comanches, Spanish, French, and Portuguese are all forgotten. But in truth, would modesty forbid us for claiming that the British Empire was probably the best? If you're comparing it with other empires, it holds up quite well, right?
Yeah, because these things can't be quantified, you can't say definitely it was the best, because as we've discussed, it was different things at different times. And I don't... Better. It was certainly better, and it was certainly better than some nation states, if China's a nation state, in the sense that even though, as we discussed earlier, colonial government was often autocratic, although not entirely insensitive to native needs and wants, the empire did spread abroad institutions of a free press. So you have the press in Hong Kong or in India or in Africa being fiercely critical of colonial government. You also have courts which sometimes were independent, and in the case of the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya, fiercely critical of colonial government. So the empire introduced liberal institutions which did hold colonial government to account in a way in which you will not find in China or Iran or Russia now.
Yes, quite.
So
that's the sort of modernity aspect, if you like, isn't it?
Yeah, but I guess the bits of empire that I defend, William, just to make clear to your listeners, are the humanitarian and liberal bits. And all I want to say to the decolonizers is, will you please admit there were humanitarian and liberal bits? Then we can argue about how to weigh these things up.
Yes.
But they simply won't admit that.
No, it's blanked out.
It is.
Yeah, it is blanked out. And that gets right back to the bias. I mean, one of the... part of my family is Australian, and for all the time I've been involved with Australia, there's been this fierce question of native title, which it's also an issue in the United States and particularly Canada. But the point that you make in the book, actually, I mean, it's a separate question. The right of conquest is a separate question to what actually happened in many cases, because in many cases the British Empire was expanded via treaties, wasn't it? So we just say a bit about that.
Yes, well, certainly. So in Canada, native peoples did make treaties with the British to cede land, partly because the native peoples had been decimated by disease, which was brought by Europeans, but it wasn't deliberately spread. So that was a tragic effect. Therefore, the populations of native peoples decreased, and therefore they were willing to cede land. And particularly in the western prairies of Canada in the 1870s and 80s, there were about 7 so-called numbered treaties made with native peoples. And the deal was, you get reserves of land where you will be protected from white intrusion, and we'll provide you with schools and agricultural education and implements so you can begin to adapt to the new world that is coming upon you, because partly through the overslaughter of bison, the basis of your native economy has disappeared.
Yeah.
You have to adapt, and native peoples realised that, and they demanded from the Canadian government that they asked for schools and the means to adapt, and that was by treaty.
But to get back to the native title question and conquest questions in these in Australia or New Zealand or Canada, I think the problem. It's a very difficult problem because if you accept native title and if you go down that route entirely, then you're delegitimizing what was, if we're honest about it, conquest. I mean, the problem that you get into is that, for instance, different Native American groups, tribes could take territory off the next and conquest. Yeah. So that right of conquest seems to be legitimate. Likewise, the Matabele might take something off the Shona and have interfactional wars for many, many years, and very few parts of that continent don't have some of that. But if a white tribe ends up in Regius and starts farming and things, that's not legitimate. So there's something about just being white which makes it not legitimate at all, where it's legitimate for any other group to do it.
No, I agree. That's well put, actually. I mean, the issue of territory and the means by which it was taken is, I think, the most troubling and most difficult issue.
It is.
There's no doubt in Australia that land was taken by settlers, often in defiance of colonial government, which sought to restrain settlers but couldn't. So there's no doubt that, in my mind, that unjust seizure of land did happen. But I don't know about Australia, but certainly North America, as you've just alluded to, native peoples were busy pushing each other off territory for centuries, long before Europeans came. So who exactly is the original owner of this?
Yes, but but to go back to Leif Erikson, and they, the first European to be born in the Americas was Story, and there was 1,000 years plus ago. So the point is, I'm making the point that politically it's a very difficult line to go down to say, to delegitimize your very existence on those continents is actually quite troubling, because what you're saying is, it ends up politically in a sort of blood and soil nativist thing, which means that actually the Irish and Scots and English, Welsh, Australians really oughtn't to be there, and that's the problem. I just sniff it in the air. I'm just saying that Australia Day is actually tested now. People are uncomfortable about it. They're calling it colonization day, and I've always, it's a fairly crude approach, but I always say just own it. It was conquest, actually. It was conquest, and if it was, then someone's got to make a case as to which bits of the planet Europeans uniquely can't conquer. That's the problem.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And both in Canada and in Australia, the tendency in recent years has been to grant native peoples more autonomy. So there's territory they would have autonomy over, which often has produced corrupt government. But quite apart from that, it begins to disintegrate the state. Because certain people have certain privileges that other people don't have. And I just think that's, again, another racially divisive.
Well, in Australia it's very difficult because in fact, in reality, there is no going back. I mean, modernity hit the place, and if it wasn't, La Perouse nearly got it. Could have been French. Heaven forfend. But it might have been quite successful. But the point is that there isn't any going back. And I've spoken at length to Australian educators about this. And actually, the only route is modern Australia coming together somehow. You can't. So it's a very, very tricky thing. But I mention it because I think it's a form of. I think it's a form of anti-European racism, actually. I think that's coming out. You say, you can't do this. Everyone else is fine. Nothing to see here. That's absolutely fine.
That's a very good point.
Which is really to get back to the motives of the anti-colonialists, there's a little adage, in a relationship, if you're arguing about the cups, it's not actually about the cups. It's about something else. And you said that actually some of these disputes really have more about the present than the past. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I mean, anti-racism is a major impulse. But again, I feel that in many cases I don't take anti-racism at face value, because if you really are concerned about unfair disadvantages in a country, you'll be very concerned to understand the causes. And I've noticed, when for example, the Sewell report of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparity was published, and suggesting that, in fact, in this country, different outcomes between different ethnic groups can have all manner of causes.
Causes, yes.
And we need to stop talking about blacks and whites, because the trouble in the tree in terms of education and the numbers of people earning over £100,000 are Indians, not whites. So it's a
well, there might be East Asians or other groups. Yes. But that's why I think that gives the lie to the point that the thing is used as a political tool, because people are inclined to say, well, I haven't got this, and it's because of what you did 200 years ago. I don't buy it. I think that's not a good explanation.
No. But also, when evidence is produced that Britain is not actually as racist as anti-racist claim we are, the reaction I notice of these people, and I do occasionally read The Guardian, is not a kind of thoughtful, deeply skeptical engagement with the data. It is dismissal. It's utter dismissal.
Total, yes.
Now, what that tells me is these people don't really care to solve the problem, because if they did, they would care to understand the diagnosis accurately.
But engage with it. I mean, what they're scared of is, like, it's, as you mentioned, because the book actually originally, I think your original kernel of thought was Bruce Gillies' academic work, which sort of scandalized a lot of people, but he's got a right as an academic to look at these matters. And isn't he cancelled? So the cancellation is you see, I think that's the whole approach to free debate, open inquiry, shut down by people that don't have the confidence to argue on the facts. It's fine.
That's the conclusion I've come to, that one reason for the hysterical reaction to what I was doing in 2017 was panic.
Yeah.
There's the originator in Cambridge, Prem Gopal, who sent her tweets to her Oxford allies, ran, and I quote, "OMG, oh my God, this is serious, SHIT, we need to block capital, shut this down." And just reflecting on that, I think there's a large measure of panic in there, that we're going to be rumbled. And I started off this. I'm not a professional historian, William, and so I've always been nervous that a professional historian would discover that I was talking nonsense. But I've been arguing about these things for 7 years now, and I'm pretty confident I got it right. And my view is these guys on the other side, the decolonizers, these emperors have no clothes.
I agree with you. No, it's just political rhetoric, and it's being used as a tool. And that particular academic from Cambridge actually said things that really ought to be cancelled. That's a different thing. I mean, there is a problem, a massive cultural problem. With some of our heroes, some of our great heroes, Churchill. We've been used to Churchill being vilified by some progressives. And the Bengal famine is mentioned, a horrific event, but and other things predating that, actually, with Churchill, the things he said and what have you. But of late, there's been an attack on Churchill by the American right. What do you make of that?
Yes.
What's going on there?
Well, I hope it's a flash in the pan, because Churchill tends to be lionized more in America even in this country. I don't know exactly what the grounds for complaining about Churchill from the right are. Is it to do with the idea that we should have kept out of the war against Nazism? Had we done so, we'd have kept the empire.
Exactly. I think it's, and it has resonances with the Ukraine-Russia war now. It's the type of right that, like Putin, particularly, I think, that are going for. They're just curious that both sides are having a go now.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I hope the attack on the right is a flash in the pan. I don't think it'll get much traction in America.
No, let's hope. Let's hope. So to sum up, then, I think what the book calls for, you're just trying to look at a balanced, a nuanced look at the imperial balance sheet, and there were many different parts, many different phases. Yes, there was domination and humiliation of people at times, the spread of disease, which is not intentional but tragic, slavery, the fact that it was undemocratic and at times extractive. But on the other side, you've got peace, stability, rule of law, cricket, individual minority rights.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, if you like that sort of thing, yeah, we do. And Sri Lanka certainly liked it a few days ago. Technology, industry, medicine, railways, and the other things. So that's what you've tried to do, isn't it? To create a balanced view of it.
Yeah. Well, in the end, in the conclusion, I come to a moral assessment. I myself say, we end up with a list of goods and bads, and you can't actually say which is more weighty. So what I then go on to say is, well, what you could say is some decolonizers try to assert that the empire was essentially racist, essentially violent, essentially oppressive, and actually Nazi. And I say, well, you can't say that. The evidence doesn't support it. And then I say, here are the positives: liberal institutions, the vision of the empire gradually relaxing into what became the Commonwealth of Nations, humanitarian impulses, anti-slavery, and then I think the fact that the empire committed itself to fighting Nazi Germany says a lot about, when push came to shove, what really mattered to it.
And volunteers. I know some were slightly coerced, but there are a lot of volunteering throughout the...
And in the conclusion to the paperback edition, I wrote a postscript to the paperback edition, William, and the conclusion to that ends up in Sicily, where I was some years ago, just south of Mount Etna. And if you drive along the road there, on the left-hand side, you come across a Second World War cemetery full of young Canadians, and among the headstones is one to someone called Anderson, who was killed in July 43. And the epitaph which really struck me was anti-fascist fighter.
Which is what he was.
Which is what he was.
Yeah.
He was a volunteer, and it was the British Empire what called him.
Well, we shouldn't forget that, Nigel, and I think you've written, this is the book, Colonialism and Moral Reckoning. I think you've written a book which is a necessary challenge to unnuanced, biased critiques of our past. And from this angle, Scott, to another, thank you.
Thank you, William, very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.